I really shouldn't be doing this. Okay, so a video that has been very highly requested is to talk about which presidential candidates, either Trump or Biden, would be better for the stock market going forward. And I've really been hesitant. I really don't want to make this video because this channel is not political. I don't ever want it to become political. And I have no interest in alienating half of you and making you guys hate me and never want to watch another video from me ever again. But at the same time, I do have a commitment to you guys to make the contents that you guys want, that you guys request, and that you guys want to see. So if you can appreciate that, please consider hitting the like button. It should really help out the channel, and subscribe if you haven't already. We're super close to 100,000 subscribers. I can't wait to hit that number. It'll be a dream come true. So please consider supporting the channel by doing those two things. But with that said, the way that we're gonna do this video so that hopefully I don't upset anyone is I'm gonna be very generous to both sides with an open mind. I'm not going to assume the absolute worst of either candidate. I'm not going to be biased, and I'm not going to endorse anyone. And I'm only going to focus on economic and stock market related topics. We're not going to be talking about civil unrest or healthcare or social issues. We're going to be focusing on economic and stock market, specifically stock market related topics. And before any keyboard warriors go off on me in the comments section accusing me of trying to influence anyone to vote a certain way, let me assure you guys, I promise you, I have no interest at all in who you vote for. I do not care at all who you guys vote for. It doesn't offend me when someone votes a certain way or what kind of political opinions or anything else that they have. It doesn't matter to me at all. Vote for whoever you think is best. And there's many different reasons to vote for someone, not just the economy and the stock market, which is what we're going to be talking about today. There's many other concerns, many other things to think about. So again, not the topic of this video about who you should be voting for. That is not what we're doing. Okay, now with all of that said, the way we're going to do this video, we're going to break it down into two separate parts. So the first part we'll be talking about just kind of briefly what I think would happen if the presidency and Congress was split, which is actually a fairly likely scenario, and how that might affect the stock market. And then we'll get right into part two, where we'll talk about each candidate. We'll start with Trump, and we'll list off the pros that Republicans or conservatives would argue in favor of Trump. So this is a way of keeping it like very fair and unbiased. So we're not going to be listing off my opinions. We're going to be talking about what I think Republicans like about Trump in terms of the economy and the stock market. And then we're going to talk about the cons that Democrats or liberals would argue against him. And then we'll transition over to Biden and we'll do the same thing. So we'll list off pros that Democrats argue in favor of Biden and cons that Republicans argue against Biden. And then after all of that, then I'll finally give my final thoughts and my opinion. Key word there, emphasis is opinion, at the end of the video. And if I had to guess which one would be better for the stock market, I'll share my thoughts on that. Okay, now starting with part one, in order for a president to really get a lot of stuff done and to really have a major impact on the economy, you really need to have a lot of cooperation with Congress. And so what would happen if the two sides are split between the two different parties? So for example, what happens if maybe Biden wins the presidency, but maybe Republicans keep control of the Senate or maybe take back the House? Or what happens if the opposite happens? Maybe Trump wins the presidency and maybe Democrats are able to keep the House or maybe take back the Senate. Well, in that scenario, which is actually a very likely one, you would think that all the arguing and negotiating and gridlock would be bad for the market because things might not get done, there might be a lot of drama, but in reality, the stock market usually likes gridlock. And the reason why is because drastic changes or extreme new policies or policy changes tend to frighten the market because we don't usually know how such radical changes will impact the economy. And if there's one thing that we know as stock market investors, it's that the stock market does not like uncertainty. And that's what we'd end up with if we're making a lot of really big changes. We'd have some uncertainty. So by having some gridlock, things stay relatively the same. Companies are free to perform business as usual, and the good companies that innovate tend to rise to the top, and the bad ones that are not run well by management tend to fall to the bottom. And then it's our job as stock market investors to pick the winners and the losers. And it's all just kind of business as usual. And over the long term, we tend to perform relatively well. So I just want to start the video off on that kind of positive footing that we're likely heading for gridlock anyway. And I know that the country is very divided right now with political views and both sides kind of hate each other, but hopefully we can just kind of calm down a bit, come together and just realize that things are probably going to be okay into the future. Okay, so let's just try to be positive. Let's try to have a positive mindset. I don't like to be a negative person, so I just wanted to start the video off that way, and hopefully that'll kind of ease the tensions a little bit in this video, because we're going to start getting into some divisive topics here. Okay, now with all that said, let's go ahead and move on to part 2, which is to look at the 2 candidates. And first up is going to be Trump. This should be fun. Okay, now starting with the pros. First up here, a pro-Trump argument is that the market has already been doing very well during Trump's first term. Not only has it been consistently breaking new record highs, but we're currently going through one of the most gigantic recessions and pandemics in history, and yet the stock market has still broken new record highs this year. Now, Trump took over on January 20th, 2017, and at that time, the S&P 500 was just under 2,300 points, and today it trades for over 3,400 for an increase of over 50%, which is pretty large growth. In other words, if you would have just invested in the broader market, or more specifically in the S&P 500 index, you would have increased your wealth by over 50% in less than 4 years. Definitely can't complain about that. Now, reps would argue that a big reason for that success was because of Trump's pro-economic growth policies. And when looking at GDP growth while Trump was in office, we had over 2% growth in 2017, over 3% growth in 2018, which by the way was the highest GDP growth we've seen in over a decade, and then another 2% plus growth in 2019, right before the pepperoni hit and sent the economy plunging in 2020, which we'll talk more about in just a second. But all of that economic growth was also despite the fact that the Fed was raising interest rates very sharply during Trump's presidency, which of course is known to slow down economic growth and is vastly different than the historically low rates that they kept for so many years during the Obama administration, which reps would also argue helped Obama greatly, but was a major headwind for Trump. Just FYI, those rates did of course come all the way back down this year due to the pepperoni, but again, we'll talk more about that in just a second. But one of the ways that Trump was able to achieve that high growth, reps argue, was by getting rid of regulations that made it much easier for companies to conduct business, expand their operations, and of course, boost their earnings, which the stock market cares so much about as they are directly tied to valuations. On top of that, Trump imposed very large tax cuts that reps argue benefited both large corporations as well as the average American taxpayer. For example, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 implemented the largest tax reform since 1986, and while Democrats definitely have criticisms about it that we'll cover in the cons section, reps would argue that it boosted the economy by lowering tax rates for nearly all Americans. It lowered the corporate tax rate by a gigantic amount from 35% all the way down to just 21%, which theoretically made companies more profitable and gave them the opportunity to buy back stock that further improved their valuations even more. And it nearly doubled the standard deduction while also doubling the child tax credit, which left more cash in American families' pockets. I do also want to add, this is a very anecdotal, but I have several family members that really hate Trump, but even they were pretty happy about the larger child tax credit because it seemed to really help them. In any case, many of these policies, Republicans would argue, boosted the economy so much that it led to record low unemployment for nearly all genders and races, right before we saw that huge spike from the pepperoni lockdowns. And finally, one last point that Republicans sometimes bring up is the fact that Trump didn't get us into any new wars that could have brought chaos and possibly damaged our economy, but instead did a pretty good job of getting peace deals done like the ones in the Middle East, while still standing up to China and fighting against IP theft that was damaging US companies, and also challenged the trade deficit, although this is a fight that continues to linger on and Democrats have been critical of. Okay, now speaking of Democrat criticisms, let's transition over to the cons section and see what Dems have to say. Well, for starters, Dems would argue that Trump has been a very unstable president that consistently flip flops, lies, or acts too aggressively, especially on Twitter, which leads to uncertainty and volatility in the stock market. I'm sure you guys remember that crazy volatility we went through during the start of the Chinese trade war, where the stock market tanked at the end of 2018, and it really felt like every day was a new tweet from Trump that the trade war was either going really bad and negotiations were frozen and new tariffs would be added, so the stock market would plummet, only to say maybe the next day that talks were back on and the market would spike right up again. And the truth is that most people in the stock market don't have the kind of long-term vision or stomach to handle that type of craziness and volatility in the market. I personally see them as great buying opportunities myself, but I remember a lot of people leaving comments telling me how much money they kept on losing because they would panic and sell at the bottom on any bad news, and then buy back at the top on any good news, and they just kind of kept consistently losing money as a result. But that's in my opinion, that's their fault. But anyway, another major criticism that Dems have is that his tax cuts really just helped the rich and didn't do a whole lot for the poor or even the lower middle class, which can lead to a weaker overall economy in the future because of higher debt levels across the board. For example, NPR states that over 60% of the tax savings from the tax cuts went to the top 20% of income earners, while corporations that are also largely owned by wealthier individuals saw their taxes fall by 40%. And instead of using a lot of the capital that was also repatriated back into the United States to pay down debt, a lot of companies just use it to buy back stock, which led to stock buybacks hitting a new record high of over $1 trillion in 2018. Meanwhile, corporate debt levels continue to climb, and while that debt usually climbs on its own regardless, the past decade has been a pretty sharp incline, which can lead to major problems down the road. And it doesn't just stop with corporations, as the same can mostly be said about household debt. So Dems would argue that these are not policies that are actually helping the economy as much as people might think, as our federal deficit continues to get larger, which they also argue is hurt by lower tax revenues, as NPR claims that corporate tax revenues fell by 31% in the first year after the tax cuts, with overall tax revenues declining as a share of the economy in each of the 2 years after that as well. Not exactly what you like to see when our budget deficit is doing so poorly. And of course, probably the biggest criticism of all that Democrats and also the media have been really hammering all year long is Trump's handling of the global health crisis. Now, this is super polarizing. It's a very polarizing subject, and Trump supporters would argue the exact opposite. But Democrats mostly feel that our devastated economy is a result of Trump's negligence and poor handling of the crisis and not taking it seriously enough, therefore leading to larger outbreaks that forced us to lock down further because we couldn't get it under control, thus having to destroy our economy, as unemployment rates at one point reached like more than 4 times what we saw even during the Great Recession, and we are still sitting really high today as we desperately try to recover. Again, Republicans or Trump supporters would argue the exact opposite, and they would say that it's Democrats that push for lockdowns that hurt the economy, but I'll stay out of this one and let you guys tell me below which one you think is more true than the other. Okay, now moving on to Biden, let's go ahead and start with the pros that Democrats usually argue in favor of him. And from what I've seen, I really feel like they mostly focus on 2 specific areas. Number one is that they believe he's a very reputable and calm leader, and more like a little bit more of a mild-mannered moderate that already served as vice president under Obama for 8 years, which translates to a proven track record of success. And then the other one that they usually argue is that he's not Trump, which is probably the point that gets emphasized the most by the media. But let's go ahead and start with the first point there. So under the Obama administration, the stock market was able to see a strong recovery following the Great Recession. Now, Obama and Biden took office on January 20th, 2009, and at that time, the S&P 500 record was sitting at about 830 points. Fast forward to when Trump took over, and that was an increase of over 170%. So very strong performance. Now, granted, that was following a giant recession. So obviously you're going to see large gains, but it's still a huge increase nonetheless. And Democrats would say that this proves that Democrat policies can also, still be very positive for the economy and for the stock market. Another thing they claim will help is that during that time, both Obama and Biden acted very presidential, and they feel that this calmness from someone who they feel is more moderate from the left will lead to the type of smooth leadership that the stock market likes to see. In fact, while critics of the left would say that Democrats are flirting too much with socialism, Biden has gone out of his way to emphasize that he is not only not a socialist, as he declared when speaking about Bernie Sanders, saying, "I beat the socialists. That's how I got elected. That's how I got the nomination. Do I look like a socialist? Look at my career, my whole career. I am not a socialist." But he has also stated that he also does not support the controversial and highly expensive Green New Deal, but instead supports the Biden plan, which Democrats say shares similarities to the Green New Deal and was inspired by it, but isn't as radical and will still lead to large spending on infrastructure that could create new jobs and stimulate the economy. In fact, Forbes states that a Biden administration will push hard for spending on infrastructure, state and local government support, green energy programs, and other large-scale government initiatives that, at least in the short term, should stimulate the economy. Now, when moving on to the second point that Biden is not Trump, Forbes also adds that Biden may have more favorable policies towards China. Now, obviously, conservatives would not be happy about that one, and even many liberals as well. But economically, it may help, at least in the short term, to have more cooperation between the world's two largest economies instead of battling through an escalating trade war. Democrats also feel that Biden will handle the current health crisis better with stricter and more straightforward restrictions and mandates, while also improving upon the communication without having so much hostility between the presidency and the media. Biden would also immediately implement what he calls the Biden Emergency Action Plan to save the economy, which focuses on three specific pillars. Number one, to use all available authorities, including the Defense Production Act, to turn the tide of the epidemic. In this pillar, he talks about getting rid of the health issue first so that we don't have to come back to more lockdowns in the future. And it focuses on things like better testing capacity, contact tracing, having equipment and supplies for hotspots, listening to health experts, assisting frontline workers, and getting the economy back through bold action that eliminates the epidemic at a realistic time instead of choosing an arbitrary date, like I'm assuming he's kind of accusing Trump of doing there. Pillar number two is to launch a task force that will give money to people that need it, keep as many people on payroll as possible, provide loans for small businesses to survive the lockdowns, and will spend whatever it takes with no caps. That's kind of interesting. And will also enforce conditions and oversight on big corporations so that any assistance given to them will go towards helping the workers instead of the CEOs or the shareholders. So that one might be bad for stocks, but good for workers, which could help the economy. But yeah, some of these are kind of a toss-up here. But then finally, pillar number three focuses on bringing Congress together to build new packages of stimulus. So basically more spending to stimulate the economy. And that would include additional stimulus checks, at least $10,000 of student loan forgiveness, increase on monthly Social Security checks, paid sick leave, free treatments for the pepperoni, and fiscal relief to states. So basically a lot of spending to stimulate the economy. Okay, now moving on to the cons for Biden. Well, the first thing that Republicans would probably mention is that they're worried Biden will focus more so on keeping the economy closed down and spending our way out of it. Now, that may not be a fair argument because we'd have to really wait and see if Biden would actually do that. But I think they would argue that Trump has at least made it much more clear that he wants the economy open, and therefore it's more likely that further lockdowns would happen under Biden if they happen at all. And that could lead to higher debt levels in the future, which could also lead to inflation. Although, of course, Trump has been no stranger to spending money either. But anyway, that's something that they might mention. They also worry that while Biden is pretty moderate, and I actually do have a few conservative friends that I asked before making this video how they felt about Biden, and even they said that they feel he's pretty moderate. But what they feel the real concern is that Kamala Harris will be the one who is actually running the show, which they feel is much further left than Biden, and that the more kind of socialist leaning parts of the Democrat Party will also pressure Biden into implementing socialist policies that would damage our more kind of free market capitalist economy. They also worry about stricter regulations on companies that will hurt their profits, drive down earnings, and therefore send stock prices falling. And finally, that he will raise taxes that will have a similar impact. Now, for the record, Biden has said that he would not raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000, but he's also said that he would eliminate the Trump tax cuts. So that's a little confusing as to what would actually happen. And he would also raise the corporate tax rate from 21% up to 28%, which conservatives argue will hurt businesses, but Democrats argue that would help with our deficit by increasing our tax revenues, thus helping the economy. So, that one's also kind of a toss-up there. Okay, so with all that said, which one of these two candidates would be better for the stock market going forward? You guys tell me. Okay, let me know down in the comment section. Let me know who you think would be better, and try to keep it civil down there, and let's just be nice to each other. In my opinion, I think we're gonna be fine either way, and I'm trying to be optimistic and I'm trying to be positive about both candidates. I think we're probably going to be fine either way. And like I said in the beginning of the video, we're probably heading for gridlock anyway, because I think we'll have a divided government. So I'm not stressing out. I think we'll be fine over the long term. I think there will definitely be volatility in the stock market. And I could definitely see a big drop. No matter what kind of happens, I could see a lot of volatility. But I think we'll be okay over the long term. And if the market was to crash, I would definitely be a buyer myself. Although obviously I'd have to look at the situation at that time. But if you really force me to take a guess here on which one would be better, and this is all speculation because there's really no way of knowing who would be better, because one of them is going to lose, so they won't get a shot at the economy and the stock market over the next 4 years. So we're really just kind of guessing here. But for me personally, I personally think that lower taxes, less government regulation, and opening up the economy, having a more pro-opening the economy stance, I think that would probably be better for the stock market. And because of that, I would assume that Trump would probably be better. But that's, again, that's not to say that I prefer Trump over Biden, and that's not to say that you should vote for in either. That's not at all. I don't even want to talk about that because that's not the point of this video. I'm just saying, if you really force me to guess here, which one would be better for the stock market? Trump, to me, in my opinion, I do think Biden cares about the stock market, and I do think Democrats care about the stock market. But Trump is like obsessed with the stock market, and he's like constantly tweeting about it and constantly talking about it, that I think he really relies on the success of the stock market as well. And if the stock market kind of fails, I think that looks very poorly on him as well. So there's just a few different factors. And I know a lot of people don't like Trump for the stock market because it tends to cause a lot of volatility with his tweeting, and the market goes up and down depending on what he says that day on Twitter and what he talks about in terms of like international policy and the trade war with China. But for me, those are all just kind of buying opportunities. So I don't really mind that volatility. As a long-term investor, anything that brings down the market is better for me because I get to buy at lower prices and then I just ride it over the long term. So anyway, that's just my opinion, and I'm just kind of guessing here. I'm spitballing. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say down below. Please keep it clean. And look, I hope I did a good job for you guys. I hope that I was very unbiased. I hope that I gave both candidates like a fair shot. And again, I really do think that we'll be fine with either one of them. So anyway, let me know if you think I did a good job. Hopefully I did. And I really appreciate all you guys' support. So anyway, thanks again for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.